Well, welcome to a landmark episode of 10 Minute Record Reviews, episode 100. And fittingly, for this landmark episode, I have here a landmark album, Led Zeppelin's debut from 1969, Led Zeppelin. This album redefines the way that rock and roll, and particularly hard rock, was supposed to sound. It's important as much for the way it's produced as it is for the amazing performances that are on the record. It's one of my favorite albums of all time. I can't wait to talk about it. Just before I do, I'd be really grateful if you haven't subscribed already, please do click that little link at the top right of your screen or at the end of the video to subscribe. Thanks. So if you're going to talk about Zeppelin, you've got to talk about Jimmy Page to start off. Grew up in the Greater London area, plays guitar from a relatively early age, joins a group in 1960 called Neil Christian and the Crusaders. During the time he's touring with the Crusaders, Jimmy develops mono. Eventually he tells Neil he's got to quit, leaves in 1962, and he goes to Sutton Art College. He's also starting to get some session work, and in particular he becomes a favorite of a producer called Shel Talmy, who at the time was managing and producing The Who and also the Kinks. And so Jimmy starts to get the opportunity to play on a whole bunch of songs which became legendary singles in the 1960s. Around this time he records quite a famous song actually, a song called Beck's Bolero, which eventually got released on Jeff Beck's solo album, Truth. The other players in that track included Beck, Keith Moon of The Who, Nicky Hopkins, a keyboardist who bounced around all kinds of famous groups in the late 60s and early 70s, but maybe most significantly, on bass, a guy called John Paul Jones. They hit it off, and John Paul Jones says to Jimmy, look, if you ever decide to pull a group together at some point, give me a shout. Subsequently, Paul Samuel Smith, who'd been playing bass with the Yardbirds, quits. Jimmy happens to be at the gig when he quits. He volunteers to join, and he does. He then moves from bass to guitar because Chris Dreja decides to play bass. And so for a short period of time, you've got Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page both playing guitar in the Yardbirds. Beck eventually leaves during this catastrophic Yardbirds tour of the US in 1967. Eventually, all the wheels fall off the Yardbirds wagon. McCartney leaves, Keith Relf, the singer, leaves, Dreja leaves, and that leaves Jimmy basically holding the bag, and the bag consisted of the name Yardbirds. So in the summer of '68, Jimmy begins to take on the project of creating a group that could realize some of the ideas he had in his head. John Paul Jones, of course, was already in the frame, so Jimmy now starts to look for a singer and a drummer. His first idea for a singer was a guy called Terry Reid. Terry Reid didn't want the gig, but he recommended a guy he knew of who was singing in a band called the Hobbs Tweedle, and the singer's name was Robert Plant. So Jimmy goes up to Birmingham to see a Hobbs Tweedle gig, and he's blown away. In his own words, couldn't believe that he wasn't already famous, couldn't believe that Plant had not already been discovered. So Jimmy invites Robert down to his boathouse. He had a boathouse in a place called Pangbourne. They sat in the boathouse, listened to records for a week or two, compared notes, shared ideas, and basically realized they had a very similar vision of what they wanted to do. Robert Plant, of course, recommends a drummer, a guy that he'd worked with in other bands, including the Crawling King Snakes, where they had met, and Band of Joy. These are both Birmingham bands. And of course, the drummer is John Bonham. So in August 1968, the four members of what was then called the New Yardbirds, very rapidly to be called Led Zeppelin, get together in London in a little rehearsal space, and the light bulb goes on. They instantly mesh, and they can feel that there is an energy and a connection between them and a unity of musical purpose, which none of them had felt before, and off they go. September, they've only been together for about a month and a half. They go into Olympic Studios in London, and they record this album. In the studio, Jimmy uses a lot of the knowledge he had developed over the past 6 or 7 years and all the sessions he'd done. One of the key innovations is the way that he mics the instruments by not only placing a microphone near the instrument itself, but also placing another microphone maybe 15, 20 feet away to get essentially the ambient echo sound. And as a consequence, what he gets from all of the instruments is a much larger sound, a much more compelling sound, and it would be a seductive sound for a whole generation, which would go on to be the music buying public of the 1970s. He gives it to Ahmet Ertegun at Atlantic Records. Ertegun loves it. They get signed. Jimmy insists on being signed to the Atlantic label and not to Atco, which was their subsidiary label where they used to put the rock bands. Any discussion of this album is always dogged by discussions of songwriting, authorship, and plagiarism, and I'll just deal with that here as a sidebar. Of the 9 songs in the album, 5 of them are either clearly original and credited as such, or are someone else's song and are appropriately credited. There are 4 others that deserve some comment. The second song on the album, Babe I'm Gonna Leave You, is originally written by Anne Breeden. But if you listen to the Anne Breeden version, not only is the lyric almost totally distinct from the Zeppelin version, The melody is also completely distinct from the Zeppelin version. Eventually the credit on this was changed to include Anne Breeden, but I actually think that's relatively generous. Other than a few words in the lyrics, I am not convinced this is the same song at all. The last song on side one, Dazed and Confused, is a much clearer example of a ripoff. It's pretty clearly a Jake Holmes song. Holmes sued and credit was given after the lawsuit. The second song on side two is a song called Black Mountainside, which bears an uncanny resemblance to a song by Bert Jansch called Black Waterside. Jansch, however, never sued because he could never conclusively demonstrate that the melody which he played was not actually a traditional melody. The final song, to which at least some of the allegations of plagiarism stick, is the very last song on the album, How Many More Times. There are some lifts in this song, particularly in the middle medley section. As Robert has freely confessed, he had only been with the band for a couple of months. They didn't know what they were going to sing, and he was often ad-libbing in the studio, and he would just grab for lyrics that he could remember. So what you really have here are mostly needless errors based on either ignorance of what the actual provenance of the song was, or Plant ad-libbing pieces in the studio based on what he could remember. Musically, there are two issues. One is Dazed and Confused, which has been corrected, and the other is How Many More Times, which has not. But I have to say, after having listened to these songs for 45 years, I actually kind of find it all beside the point. This was a group of 4 musicians who ended up creating a sound across 9 different tracks in this album, which was absolutely distinct from anything else which had come before, which was absolutely an innovation. Is there some intellectual property sloppiness? Absolutely. Is this in any way a derivative album or an album which owes its place in the sun to those borrowings? Absolutely not. So side one starts with Good Times, Bad Times. There are so many hooks in this short little song. Those opening notes, that main riff, those descending 3 chords in the bridge, a total statement of intent. Then we're immediately into one of my very favorite songs of all time, one of my Desert Island discs, Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You. This is an achingly beautiful song, and it's also the song which made Robert Plant realize how good this band was actually going to be when he heard it playing back over the headphones. It's got those beautiful arpeggios, variations on an A minor chord. It's got that little bit of Spanish flourish to the guitar. Another brilliant song which absolutely encapsulates light and shade. That's followed by You Shook Me. This song's notable for a number of reasons, but one of which is the amazing segue in the solos between the harmonica and the guitar, which is absolutely seamless. Jimmy, the master producer, you really have to listen carefully to notice when the one instrument becomes the other because the tone of the instruments achieved is so similar. The final song on side one is a major highlight, and a song which actually took on a total life of its own and became a centerpiece of their live set over the years, and that of course is Dazed and Confused. This is another song which is absolutely laden with hooks, and after that final note of the song fades out, I often find myself sitting reflecting on the first side of the album like the guy in the Maxell ad. Side 2 starts with Your Time Is Gonna Come, which along with the next song is a bit of a preview of the folky sounds that are going to pop up again on Led Zeppelin 3. The song's got some great attributes. It's got that big organ sound, it's got a lot of depth. I think actually as a piece of songwriting it's a little lightweight. Then we're into a total change of pace, which is Black Mountainside. This is a wonderful piece of music, beautifully recorded. It's got tabla drums played by a guy called Viram Jasani, who's one of only a handful of people, along with Ian Stewart and Sandy Denny, to be outside musicians playing on a Zeppelin album. And it provides an excellent contrast between the kind of country rock, organ-heavy music of the preceding song with the song which follows, which of course is Communication Breakdown. Amazing little piece of pre-punk power pop. It's a tight, hooky little number. Everybody's playing at 100 miles an hour. And it's also interesting because it's one of the only Zeppelin songs where you can hear the other members of the band singing backup. Then it's the second 12-bar blues on the album, I Can't Quit You Baby by Willie Dixon. This is a tour de force for Robert. It's also the debut of the legendary guitar versus voice battle, which occurs in this song towards the end, which of course would occur in different guises throughout their live performances in the history of their live concerts. The album concludes with How Many More Times, which is a song which they concluded their concerts with during their first year of existence. In my opinion, this is the best song on the album. That bass line is amazing, paired with Bonzo's hi-hat at the beginning. That is a really serious groove. There is an epic performance by Robert Plant on vocals, borrowing of lyrics notwithstanding, and the fact that The middle section, which is so remarkable, is ad-libbed effectively in the studio. It tells you something about how in sync these musicians were at this particular time and how ready they were to do the things they did on this record. As I said, this is an album which changed the world. It's pulled together in 2 months from the first time they get together to rehearse to finishing recording in October. The sound is huge, its effect is powerful and thrilling. The sense of timing and dramatics is just off the chart. The songs are great, but the playing and production are also something else. This album confirms the point that Jimi Hendrix had started making, which was that we were now in the era of the virtuoso rock musician. This is an album recorded by a band who had been together for 2 months, but who sounded like they'd been together for a decade, so cohesive was their vision. It's a singular experience despite the diversity of the material, and it's 5 out of 5.